Well, that worked. Let me show you. That's what's making the noise. Those are generators for that. And they're very loud, so we're going to have to relocate. So it's not exactly quiet in here, but it's a lot better than it is out there if you look out this window. There's no oil rig, it's just Mother Nature. There's actually cows out there. Now, again, this is going to be a video inspired by comment wars with socialists some time ago now. I wanted to make a video about monopoly, but honestly that's really too big of a topic to address, and some of the underlying assumptions and the arguments against free markets that apply to monopoly are a little bit more general than that. And I think it's really important just to address even just single myths, even though those myths are only an incorporated part of a whole ideology. And the one I want to address here is the idea that there's a tendency towards monopoly, and one of the main reasons for this is that there's basically a vicious circle where the bigger you are, the more efficient you become, the more competitive you become, and so the bigger you get, and it's a vicious circle where, a kind of a social Darwinist survival of the fittest, where you're going to end up with one firm. Implicit within this argument is the idea that basically capital is its own reward. If you have capital, and that capital gives you an advantage over other people, who will then never be able to, if you have the most capital, no one's ever going to be able to outproduce you, underbid you, that you'll always have the lowest prices, which means you'll always have a growing market share, you'll become a monopolist. And this is actually a pretty pervasive myth. One is that both proponents and opponents, roughly speaking, of capitalism believe it. So obviously socialists believe this, and Democrats and liberals and lots of conservatives also. But even big industrialists are on record as basically saying that this is inevitable. And some of them say it in the context of that's good and we should encourage that, and others say it in the context of that's bad and we should it's true that it's going to happen, but it's something that we should try and guard against. And beyond that, the other reason it's so pervasive is that there is a certain element of truth to the myth. There is something to the idea that the more capital that you have, the more efficient you are, and the more competitive you can be. I'm going to address that later. First, I want to talk about the belief that this is inevitable. Many people believe this, and it's kind of the antagonistic reason for the progressive movement. People believe, hey, we've got, because at the end of the 19th century there was a large series of major mergers like U.S. Steel and United Harvester and Standard Oil, and that was when we first started to get really big firms. Before that we hadn't had huge, gigantic firms. There had been wealthy people. I think I read the other day that if you look in like 1840, there were maybe 500 millionaires or something like that, and in 1900 there were 50,000 millionaires. I mean, the number in the United States, the number had just skyrocketed. And what's interesting too is in that period there was actually deflation, and so a millionaire in 1900 was more wealthy than a millionaire in 1840 was, by a couple percent, or probably, I don't know how much, but by quite a bit. Now, what's interesting though, the first, but we got the John D. Rockefellers and the Andrew Carnegies. They're saying, look, this is going to happen. You're going to have one big firm taking over. Sometimes they say it's good, sometimes they say it's bad. You've got all the leftists saying, obviously people like Upton St. Clair, so we've got consensus, there's unanimity here. The first little bit of doubt that you should have, though, is when the rich capitalists say, this is inevitable, this is going to happen, and they say that in the context of requesting that government basically consolidate this. So around the turn of the century, you had many big capitalists like J.P. Morgan, for instance, who, and we don't know what they really believed in their hearts. I think that there's enough people out in the world that you're going to have people who sincerely believe this and other people who didn't believe this but said it anyway for cynical reasons. Because they would say, look, it's just natural, it's the most efficient. The biggest steel company, for instance, is going to be the most efficient one. The most efficient one is going to be the best at satisfying consumer wants, and so we should just embrace this. We should embrace the idea of a monopolist, of a single corporation dominating, at the very least, a single industry. But what's interesting about this is in the context of them speaking with political leaders like Roosevelt or Howard Taft or McKinley or Woodrow Wilson. And what they were beseeching the government to do was to basically create that scenario. That scenario didn't exist. They were saying, we want the government to make it happen. This is very interesting when somebody says, this is inevitable, though I need the government to make it happen, or somebody else. That's a very interesting, because if it's truly inevitable, then there's no point asking the government to have to do it. That is a clue that at the very least the person who is asking has some doubt as to whether that's the case. This is I was thinking of an analogy for this. It's almost like when I was a kid, I used to believe that if you were on a swing set and you kicked your legs hard enough, eventually you would be able to go all the way around. It seemed logical. It really seemed, because you start and you kick your legs a little and you go farther and farther and you go really far and you have a lot of momentum, and it just seems totally plausible that you should be able to go all the way around. There isn't any board up there to stop you. It should be possible. And that's the trajectory, right? You're going, you swing your legs and you go farther and farther and farther and farther, and if that's the trend, then you should be able to do it. And every kid believes that. And everybody believes that in a free market you're going to have a monopoly that's going to develop on its own. And yet, a similarity between the analogies is I never actually saw anybody do that with a swing. Never. Once or twice I heard some fifth graders tell me that they had seen it done, but when you press them where they had seen it, who did it, so you could ask that person, they wouldn't know. So we have a lot of people alleging that free market's going to lead to monopolies, but how many free market monopolies have there ever been? When did Standard Oil become the only producer of fuel oil in the United States? Not quite ever. At its zenith, when it was its most powerful, it controlled 90% of the market. But people worry about monopoly in the context that it's a single provider, and as a single provider, it can then raise prices to whatever it wants because everyone needs oil, and so they'll have to pay, and they can just double their prices. Well, Standard Oil is in a unique position. John D. Rockefeller, and I have many qualms about him, was a genius when it came to running a business. He was ruthless, absolutely ruthless, and it was a new industry. The first oil well in the United States was drilled in 1868. Standard Oil was incorporated in Ohio in the 1870s. I forget exactly which year. He was a pioneer, and yet he never was able to destroy all of his competition. He always was lowering prices. He was consistently making oil cheaper and cheaper. He never got to the stage where he started upping the price. So even though he had a large market share, the only effect that had was to make fuel cheaper so poor Americans could stay warm in the winter and afford to feed their children even more wholesome, more food, or buy clothing or books, or they're saving money. They're becoming wealthier because of his competitive practices. You might argue that, well, if he actually became a monopoly, then he'd be able to gouge his prices. But that never happened. And people will say, well, that's because eventually they busted him up with the Sherman antitrust laws. By the time that had happened, he'd been losing market share for 20 years. He wasn't at that 90% anymore. He was more like in the upper 60s to low 70%. And we could go on and on. U.S. Steel was never, even when it did its great merger in 1901, was it ever a monopoly? Was it the sole provider within the country? This could go on and on and on. It's never actually happened. And so one asks the question, as I did the 5th grader, okay, it seems reasonable, but it's never actually happened. So there isn't any proof, and indeed, there's so many kids on swings, to go back to the analogy, the fact that we've never seen it actually happen might mean there's something to the idea that maybe it's not possible. And if there aren't any examples of free market monopolies, one has to question, is it something that we can take for granted? Now, there's 2 books. I think I've recommended them one before. One is The Triumph of Conservatism by Gabriel Coco. Again, that is a must-read. Another one that I have just started, I'm only about 50 pages into it, is called In Restraint of Trade by Butler Schaefer. That's already a great read, and I'm only 50 pages in. Basically, the empirical studies are that as corporations become larger, they actually become less profitable. So when U.S. Steel merged, it actually began to lose market share. At the time of its merger, it was about 80% of the U.S. market. 20 years later, it was 60% of the market. Same thing with Standard Oil, same thing with International Harvester. Not every single big merger lost lots of market share, but none of them became monopolies, and most of them did. The companies with the highest profitability are not the smallest ones, but the ones one rung above that. You know, the not quite medium-sized, but past startup. Those are the highest profit margin companies. At least it was in the turn of the century, in the progressive era, the era of free market capitalism, so-called. And so, if we look at just at the history, it's never really happened. So that should cause people to question why. Now, where this logic goes wrong is, like I said, there's this implicit belief that capital is its own reward. And what's interesting about that is, it is true, the more capital you have, the longer your production line is, the more efficient you can be, the lower the cost per unit produced. And that is true. That is 100% true. But there's an element in the market economy that socialists and even a lot of free market people overlook. And I'm going to use a different analogy here, but one more directly related. Let's say I'm the quintessential fat cat. I never worked hard. My parents were very wealthy, and I inherit a huge amount of money. You know, they're just all the money I could want. And I say, well, you know what? Even though I am richer than any person could ever dream to be, I am so avaristic that I am not satisfied by this, and I want to become even richer. And because of this wealth, it should be a foregone conclusion that I'll succeed. So I buy a huge factory, you know, all this capital equipment, you know, the entire whole shebang, bigger than anybody else out there, the biggest factory in the world. And socialists around the world, like, hey, this guy, he has an unassailable advantage over any potential competitor. And so, in the long run, he's going to take over, or I'm going to take over. And I stand there, I hire all the best managers. You know, I go around and I just say, I'll pay you higher wage, or I mean, I don't know how else I would get them to come there, but just imagine I somehow convince them to go there without giving them higher wages. You know, that's stupid. And then I'm surveying my factory and I say, go now, build buggy whips. Well, what's going to happen? I'm going to go out of business because, you know, there's no demand for buggy whips. And the fact that I can produce many huge quantities of them very efficiently does not guarantee that I'll have a profit, because there isn't a demand for buggy whips. Not to eat up the supply I'd be able to provide, and so I will lose money. I will consume my wealth. And you could say that's a stupid example, because no one's going to be that dumb to just build buggy whips. They'll build something important like cars. To be so simplistic to just say, oh, it's all you have to do is build something people want. Yeah. Try and think of something that people want that you're going to be able to build and make a profit at. All right, General Motors builds cars. And I remember in 2007, they lost $15 billion in one fucking quarter. And they have a lot of experience building cars. They're the biggest car company in the history of the world, and have been for like almost 100 years at that point. And they lost money, even though they had all these factories. There's an episode of The Simpsons where Homer's long-lost brother appears for one episode, and it turns out he's an executive in Detroit at a company, although they don't say which one, make-believe one. And he decides Homer is the man of the people. He knows, he has an intuitive sense of what consumers would want. I'm going to give him carte blanche to design whatever car he wants. And he designed it. It had a space hood and fins, and the horn, instead of just regular beeping, when you press it, it would play La Cucaracha. And at the big unveiling, you know, this guy looks at it and says, "Are you kidding me? That is a piece of shit. How much does it cost to build that thing?" And they're like, "It costs $100,000 to build each one of those." And he realizes, oh wait, no one is, I mean, if it costs $20 to build, I'm sure we could sell a whole bunch for $25. No one's going to buy that for, well, we need to make a profit. And he goes out of business. All right? And that's a dramatic, fictional example, but real-world examples exist all the time. So the element that they've missed in their capitalism is going to just dominate everything is the idea of entrepreneurship, which isn't a class of person, it's a class of activity that we all gain acting. When you quit one job and go to another one, you're being an entrepreneur with your labor. Now, some people like to say, well, if you're being an entrepreneur with other people's capitalists or with other people's capital, then that's what we're going to call an entrepreneur. Fine, but it's a type of human action, buzzword. And without that element, capital is no guarantee. It is something that could be useful, but it is also something that can be misused, and there's enormous risk and waste in that. So, and we could go through the examples. Another one I like to say is like pizza companies. You've got Domino's, you've got Pizza Hut, you've got Little Caesars. Big, you know, they have hundreds or thousands of locations, and then you have little mom and pop shops. Like, how could they ever compete? Well, let's say for some reason there suddenly becomes a demand for an alternative type of pizza. Let's say one baked in a stone oven. I've seen these in a few places. You know, somebody comes out with a book on Oprah about how that's the best kind of pizza, and people want to switch to it. Well, if you're a mom and pop shop, you just go out and buy one. It's maybe expensive, maybe you got to save your money, maybe you take out a small business loan, but you do it, you're done. What if Domino's wants to switch to using that same oven? They might get a discount because they're going to buy a lot of them, but you're talking about replacing them in, I think Domino's has something like 1,800, 2,000 locations. Somebody's going to be an ass and figure it out and write 1,200 locations or whatever, but hundreds and hundreds of locations spread across the entire country and indeed the world. For them to make the transition would take years. And I know there's a YouTube user named K Biomech, an anarcho-capitalist who worked at Domino's for a long time. And he said, yeah, for them to make even minuscule changes, it took years to roll out. And the thing is what if they start doing that, and a year later people realize that stone ovens, you know, make you fat, like pizza wouldn't. Oh, and that it's a bad idea. They've just wasted an enormous amount of time and effort. So basically, the bigger you are, the less adaptive you are, the slower you are, and the higher price you pay for any mistakes that you will inevitably make. And so it does not guarantee success. It is not its own reward. It's not a vicious circle where you accumulate capital and then you can accumulate more capital and then you can accumulate more capital. If you are a good entrepreneur and you repeatedly make the right decisions over and over and over and over and over again, yes, you can. But nobody is a superior human to the extent that they can make the right decision repeatedly forever. Eventually they will make a mistake. And it's not even that they make a mistake. It doesn't have to be a stupid car that Homer Simpson designed. You could make a high quality car, and someone else can make one that's just a little bit better, or in some very unpredictable way is superior on the market and outcompete you, even if you have more capital. So it's not its own reward. It's not a given. The biggest don't always get bigger. And of course there are other problems with the whole monopoly idea. If somebody's really being profitable, that's a guarantee to draw other investors into an attempt to enter that market to also make a profit. And so the success of a company guarantees future competition because others will seek to emulate this competition, provided there is a free market and there isn't a government that is preventing that from happening, which is indeed actually what the progressive era was all about. It was an attempt to restrain trade, the use of regulatory capture or rent seeking more generally. Big corporations going to the government and saying, outlaw my potential competition, or at the very least restrict it, raise the barrier of entry, issue licenses, have regulations, sometimes explicitly ban, and of course do it in the name of consumer protection. That's the reason I want you to do it, but that's not the reason they're actually doing it. So, I mean, this is a real easy thing for people to misunderstand. There's just this tendency. I remember I used to play a game online. I played it once where you were like a fish, and every time you hit a smaller fish, you got bigger, and eventually you'd be the biggest fish. You could take over. Monopoly is the same way. Someone eventually always becomes a monopolist on Monopoly, except there's only a set number of pieces on a Monopoly board. You can't have new people enter the market. So it's not exactly a reasonable basis for society at large. There's also, and this is a little bit more technical, basically the bigger you are, the harder it is to manage, especially if you integrate vertically and horizontally. Some libertarians out there have pointed out that this is actually a demonstration of the socialist economic calculation problem as put forward by Ludwig von Mises in 1921. Basically, if you own everything, then it becomes very difficult to cost account. If you own the coal mines and the railroads and the smelting plants and the factory, you're not paying anybody like a good and service for that, and so it's harder for you to estimate how valuable it is. And today, lots of companies actually refrain from owning things that they use all the time for that very reason. It's absurd how often companies rent things, even wealthy companies. I work in oil. Everybody out here has got company cars, company trucks. They're almost always leased. And these are companies that have enough profits, that have enough revenue, that they could afford to buy outright a fleet of trucks, but they don't, because they worry that if they did that, then they'd be paying for the engine repairs, they'd be paying for all the fuel, they'd be paying for all these things that they can't, they'd be sunk costs instead of just a flat-out fee that's predictable. They know what the rent is. The rent is X. If they're owning it, they got to calculate all that other shit, and so they don't do it. Or not all. It's not like they always do it. I used to own stock. I was never a big person in the stock market. I had a relative who would give me stock for like Christmas and birthdays and stuff. And I had stock in PepsiCo, the parent company of Pepsi. This is a very large company. And they own a huge number of restaurants. They were the biggest restaurant chain in the United States. They own Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and Wendy's, and several others that are less well known. In addition to things like Ruffles, the potato chips, and a whole bunch of other things. And it was probably more than 10 years ago now, they divulged themselves of all their restaurants, and they formed a new company called Tricon. Now, why did they do that? Because it was too hard to manage a pop company or a soda company. We call it pop machine, Coca-Cola, whatever you call it. In the United States, that's an interesting example of vernacular changes. People call it different things in different areas. We call it pop where I'm from. It was too hard to manage all that, and so the people within the company were like, we could make more money if we were just our own. They actually both agree. The people who are mostly involved in Pepsi and the people who are mostly involved in the restaurant companies were like, we could each individually make more if this wasn't a big company, or as big as still a huge company. So they divided, and that happens all the time. It happens quite frequently, and there's no element in socialist ideology that would explain why. That's an enigma to them. Just like people getting paid more than minimum wage is a mystery that they don't understand. But it's not that they don't understand it. They don't even confront the reality that happens. If government wasn't mandating wages, we'd all be working for $1 a day. Like, why don't we all make minimum wage now then? No law that says I make what I make. And it's not just me. It's like 91% of the populace that's employed makes more than minimum wage, something like that. So companies are always diverging. The thing is, the world is always changing. It's always changing. If we were in equilibrium, if we were in stasis, if we weren't changing at all, then yeah, it would be very easy to just accumulate capital and be like, this is exactly what's always going to happen. We're always going to build X. It's always going to cost Y. Let's just make the factory bigger and bigger, and we'll be able to have a lower cost per unit. But the world fucking changes. And that means that you have to change with it, and you have to change correctly. And this is actually what was really happening at the end of the 19th century. Is the structure of production was changing. Society was changing, and now large firms were arising. But it wasn't some kind of axiomatic, automatic, evolutionary inevitability that they would continue to rise. Structures of production changed, and so in certain industries it became advantageous for there to be large firms, and so there were. None of them ever became monopolies, or even really close to that in the sense of being a single provider, or to getting to the point where they're able to, quote, gouge prices. That's never happened, unless they can outlaw their competition, which has happened, unfortunately. It's happened to a certain extent in almost every industry. It's happened really far in a couple of industries. I mean, and these are the industries, by the way, that our people bitch about the most. The healthcare industry is heavily regulated. The oil industry, at certain areas in it, the oil industry has many different layers. There's bottlenecks at a couple of it. The biggest one I'm aware of is at oil refining. Oil refining is an oligopsony. I'm sorry, an oligopoly, not an oligopsony. Well, it's an oligopsony if you're on the market to get a job refining oil, but but in other things, I mean, there are companies that basically come and take the trash off oil rigs, and there's lots of those. You know, there's lots of companies that actually own the mineral rights. There's more than anybody's aware of. That's what the Koch brothers do. Who's ever heard of Koch? And everyone's heard of BP and Exxon and all these. Who's ever heard of the Koch brothers? Other than the evil conspiracy behind libertarianism. You know, no, nobody. So, capital is not a magical reward. It's a risk. It's an asset that has a cost. That oil rig that I showed you before, the people who own that can't afford to make a mistake with it. They have to provide a quality service to the customer, who is the company who owns the mineral rights. If they don't, there are other oil rigs out there. They have to keep that thing busy. That thing costs millions of dollars to make. It costs tens of thousands of dollars every single day just to sit and do nothing. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars a day to drill a well. And it's extremely taxing. It's high intensity, all kinds of, it's out in the weather, all the geological forces of the tectonic plates are like thrust upon it. And I've been on, when I first came out here, there were 2 different drilling companies, 2 of them. And they were both doing fine. They drilled the wells at the same, and one of them had an oil spill. Someone came, they were delivering fuel. You know, they have trucks come and deliver fuel, and they accidentally let it go, and it went into a creek. Now, oil company came, they cleaned up the creek. It cost lots of money. They were able to fix it, and they went to that and said, you guys are done. We are never going to have you out here again. Why would we have a company that's going to make a stupid mistake like that when we can have somebody else do the same job with all the headache? So they're gone. The other day, it was the middle of the night, I got a phone call, and I said, hey, one of the oil rigs out there, they don't have someone who does what you do out there. They're having problems. They need you to go. They need somebody to go out there and tell them what they're drilling in, what the formation is. So I had to go. It was horrible. Like this, it was night. But my boss said he'd pay me an entire day wage, so I made double pay that day. But anyway, I got there, and there was what's known as a company man. He's basically in charge of the rig. He doesn't own the rig. He's an employee. He gets paid a wage every day. I went out there, did my job, and I had to sit out there basically all night, and I got to talking to him. Turns out he used to own oil rigs. He used to own a company. He actually owned oil rigs. He was a capitalist. He owned enormous amounts of capital relative to the average person. Not relative to, like Boeing or Exxon, but he owned several oil rigs. He's a wage laborer now. But he had capital. Capital just, you have an oil rig, all you got to do is sit back and no. You have to keep that oil rig busy all the time. You can't just say, well, let's work for a day and live off that. No. you got to keep it busy all the time, because to pay off the costs of buying it and or building it, you probably have to take out a loan, you got to pay interest, you got to pay labor, blah, blah, blah. It has to be busy. You have to be billing an oil company all the time. Every day it's not drilling is money lost. Just like you build a bridge. There's a famous bridge in Michigan called the Mackinac Bridge that was built by private investors. It's a huge, for like 50 years, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It's since been surpassed, but it's 5 miles long. It connects the UP and the Lower Peninsula. The Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The investors who built it set a date, said it has to be open by this day. Because if we are not collecting tolls by that day, then we will not be able to keep up with the interest payments along with the upkeep costs of running the bridge. So, you know, this company man that I talked to, he wasn't able to do it. He did it for years. He had a company for like 11 years, he said. And he just couldn't keep it up. There were too many other people out there. And so he's out of the market. That capital has been acquired by somebody else. He was replaced by more competitive firms. But other people will try. I know I've heard of doctors who have bought oil rigs before. You know, they say they have a portfolio, they're able to buy one. You know, so capital is not a magical. It's not like Jack's beans that just grow into a giant beanstalk. It requires an entrepreneurial element that is not a given. And in a changing society, in a changing world, it is guaranteed that mistakes will be made and that those will cost things. And empirically, larger firms have lower profit margins because they're just less adaptable, they're slower to change, and their mistakes cost a whole lot more. So this is a myth. This is not true. This is false. This is something that everyone believes, like the fifth graders who think that you can go around on a swing. But it's bullshit.